Good afternoon. I want to thank everybody who joins us here in the Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform. We continue our operation. My name is Olga Otomanova, and it's day 295 of the heroic resistance of the Ukrainian people. And now we will be talking on the adoption of the law on media. Joining us online is Mykyta Poturaiev, the chair of the Parliamentary Committee on Humanitarian and Information Policy. Good afternoon, Mr. Mykyta. Good afternoon. Nice to see you. I'm reminding our spectators and listeners that the law on media is one of the criteria required for Ukraine to join the European Union. The law was adopted on Tuesday. It was voted for by 299 people's deputies. So can you give us some more comments on this law? Well, we already discussed it multiple times, and I'm just reminded you about the changes, what changed in the Ukrainian legislation on media. It says the equal rules for all the players in the media market in Ukraine. So we consciously didn't make any difference between online media or TV or radio or printed media. So this is why it's called on media. It covers all the media existing in Ukraine. So that's the first important thing, and this is what makes it in fact the media code. We met yesterday with the members of the working group to completely implement the requirements of the European Union on audio and visual services. Another law to be adopted is the law on advertising. So we should, word for word, do the same what we did with the law on media, like word for word. And in the law on media, it all concerns media, and we should do the same with what concerns the advertising. So it's a small law. We have already a small draft, and I hope that after Christmas holidays we will be able to discuss it with the European experts and then to register it, well, depending on whether they will have any remarks. And in the beginning of the next year we should vote for it. I hope that the parliament will do it. It will be way easier than the story with the law on media. So yeah, we've been talking about this law on media. It's pretty extensive, but it can be turned into a number of presentations which may be shown by or demonstrated by program directors, for example, posted on the walls, or by some advertising managers. So where you work, in the area where you work in media, you just take the section which covers your activity and you understand what are the rules of your in the area of your responsibility. And those rules, they are very straight. They do not allow any we worked on it very thoroughly. They allow no ambiguities, and some estimates that can be turned any way you want. So we set the transparent rules for the media that cannot be manipulated no matter how much some may want it. We completed a number of tests. We modeled different conditions and circumstances that we created, like model different situations. So it was not politicians who were writing that law. It was written jointly, and in our working group, it comprises media lawyers from different civil organizations who we cooperated with our European colleagues. We want to thank them for that. there was a systematic support from the Council of Europe within a number of years, and without such support, it would be way more difficult for us to do that. They did support our experts, so again, media lawyers in the working groups and representatives of media organizations, and obviously us as politicians. Like me, I'm a politician, but with the media, say, background, so I was looking it from not a political vantage point, but rather from the vantage point of media, or how it operates. So I kind of tried it on myself, as if I would have been working with the media, how comfortable it would be for me. So I think that obviously the issues of sanctions is also described in the law. We may even get some blame for this sanction system. I mean, we may be asked to soften it, but we made it really more flexible and more comprehensible. So first there is a warning, then a penalty, and then deprivation of license. So we think that I wouldn't say it's repressive, but it's pretty hard system. So we implemented notices. So it's the information mechanism. It's the National Council. They sent a notice to a media organization, and those notices, I mean, the number of them is being documented, but they do not remain on file. And when a certain number of notices is accumulated, only then the National Council proceeds to the sanctions. And further on, so upon accumulation of a certain number of notices, then we proceed to penalties, and upon a certain number of penalties, the license may be revoked. There was a number of unfaithful speculations, but I have to tell you that no single Ukrainian media may be revoked a license without a court award. So the regulating authority should resort to court proceedings in order to revoke the license from a media organizations. So basically, the rights of the media are now expanded. But there is a flip side also. We understand that on one hand, there are rights of the media. On the other hand, some deputies and activists, they say that this draft law eases the operation of Russian media industry, and there are some dangerous moments which would allow Russian culture to penetrate our media space. For example, we say about the decrease of Ukrainian quota on radio, and the TV channels will be allowed to show movies in Russian language. I don't know who may start thinking about, start talking about things like this today, but upon the first reading, I have to say that we cooperated with Volodymyr Vyatrovich, and and Taras Shamaida, with Sergei Osmuch, with whom we cooperated on developing certain sections of the law. And they represent the organizations which guard the Ukrainian language and the interests of the Ukrainian language. So we described all those issues in the law. So we actually reinforced the mechanisms of implementation of Ukrainian language and Ukrainian media producers of Ukrainian media products. And that's why the Commissioner Taras Kremin, the commissioner for Ukrainian language, he made a statement before voting this law that he asked the parliament to support the law, specifically because the law describes all the issues for protection of Ukrainian language, Ukrainian national culture. So all those issues are described in the best way possible. It was our joint effort. And again, I can say that I'm not ashamed, but I'd rather say we're proud the way that we did it, and that work allowed us at least to start creating the atmosphere of trust and cooperation between the civil activists, between civil organizations and the media. Because there was certain distrust, there is a story behind that, but we will not stop at that right now. But I hope that we made the first step to renew that trust by working on that law. So nothing like that, nothing like you described is contained in this law. We have questions in the studio. Good afternoon, Maria Gonchar, Ukrinform. I have a few questions as to the amendments to the law. The final edition of the law does not contain the provisions on during the operation of media during the elections. Can you comment? Is there be a new law developed which will regulate the operation of media during the elections? Yeah, that was a compromise, kind of painful compromise for me and my colleagues. Unfortunately, European Solidarity and Motherland fractions, and as well as Dmytro Rozumkov and his political partners, they required us to remove it from the transitional provisions. Why we did so? Because it was described in a very high quality way. It guaranteed the rights of the media. It decreased the political pressure on media. We did it together with Opora and Chesno and IFES and other with engagement of other international foreign experts, together with media. So it was a very high quality and efficient, well, potentially high quality and efficient provision section. I understand some politicians who still want to keep some levers of influence on media, and this is how it happened. That shouldn't we have come to this painful compromise, unpleasant for me, it would impede the adoption of the law. But we said at once that, like, next week we will register the amendments as a separate law as the amendments to the elections code. I already asked our European colleagues to include it into the conditions, into the terms of conditions. Yeah, it wouldn't be one of the 7 conditions, but we have monitoring in place. We're under monitoring by the European Council and European Commission. So I'm just asking our European colleagues to note that, to add it to the list of conditions to be complied with, because I'd say all the monitoring missions during elections, they noted that you need to improve that. You need to improve the monitoring process, and it lasted for years, and we tried to correct it, we tried to improve it, but we faced resistance to regulate it. But we will fight for it. I'm convinced that together with our European partners, we will be able to break this situation, and we will have proper regulation for media during the elections process, which comply with the European standards in the way that we did, in the way that we already wrote it. So we just need to implement it. And the second question is, your parliamentary committee works on the amendments on the law on advertising. Where can we expect the registration of such law in the parliament? We have to discuss it with our European colleagues. They changed it a little bit when we were coming with the law on media. We were going under the old procedure, and we had to first vote it in the first reading, then to make amendments before the second reading, and then to pass the second reading. Now we already have experience when our European colleagues, they already agree to check the text before it's registered, and they can evaluate it, they can submit their proposals on changes and alterations, and then we can add those changes and only then register the draft law. So I hope that we will do it with the law on advertising. We already submitted the draft to the office of Olga Stepanishin for the translation, and it will be handed to our European partners. But let's face the truth. It's Christmas holiday season coming, so I think that maybe in the beginning of the next year we will get their comments and we will see what we will need to change in the text of the law. We'll get back to them with the updated text, but we just wrote it word for word. So I think we have our national legislation, you know. It only seems difficult. You just have to write the directive, but we have to write it in a way that it operates properly and it is not in contradiction with the national legislation. So this is a more complicated work, but it's on the other hand easier because it's a smaller number of changes to be added. So we just translated it word for word into Ukrainian, and I think we added it properly in the context of our national law. And I hope, and we will insist on it as a parliamentary committee, to have that law registered during the first meetings of the parliament, first sessions of the parliament. But again, it depends to a large extent on our European partners as soon as they check the language of the law and we have their evaluations and comments. Well, I cannot help asking about another draft law, the draft law on update on the legal regulation of religious organizations. If you can give us a few comments on the prospects of that law. I have a positive outlook in this regard because the Council of National Security and Defense, upon the order of the president, we see how the security service works properly in this regard. I mean, with regard to the religious organizations. And I want to emphasize that this issue is not as simple as it seems, because that there is an opinion in the society like, let's prohibit some charge, but as a European country or the country which wants to start the negotiations on joining the European Union next year, we cannot do it because we will immediately have a suit submitted to the Human Rights Court on Human Rights, and we will obviously lose, and it will be shame for us as the country and as the society. And secondly, we will not achieve the result we want. So we should do it in a steady and weighted manner. There are two draft laws that we recommend for the Parliament to consider next year. Well, I'm just calling it, is one Mykola Kняжицький and another Irina Kняжevich. And we will have the parliament consider both of them. One of them is on prohibition of the Russian Orthodox, so-called Russian, so-called Orthodox, so-called charge, because in my personal opinion, it's neither of the three. And in accordance with that law, certain Ukrainian religious organizations will have to demonstrate that they have no connections to that organization. Well, the concept of the innocence presumption is familiar to everybody. So I think that any religious organization can prove that they have no connections to this criminal charge, so to say. But we'll see how it goes. But us as the state, we do not intrude into the religious affairs. We just stand on guard of the freedom of conscience. It's a basic freedom of human being, like the content in the Declaration of the Human Rights. So we just protect our country from external influence, enemy influence. And we have a number of religious organizations in the country who have connections with, and that they should prove that they have no connections to the country, to the criminal country, to the terroristic country, their enemy. And the second law, I'm a co-author to that law. It just facilitates the transition. It's not the law on some certain church, but it's a law on religious organizations. For example, if a religious community wants to change their registration, so to say, people should have the right to do it, and they can do it without some excessive bureaucracy. Because, for example, if there is a religious community in some village, people don't have a lot of money there, they should be allowed to hire lawyers. So it was not the bad rules which were set previously, but people who wrote those rules, they did not think back then that for many adherents of the church, it's not so easy to comply with that law. And now that we have military administrations, for example, within the last, say, 3 years, we have dozens and dozens of documents without moving in the smaller communities because there are certain mistakes, because people were not able to draw the documents in a proper way. It's not their fault. People are unsatisfied now because they've taken that decision years ago. So we don't cancel any rules. There will be no raidership. We'll just make it easier so people could use those rules normally. So what's the essence of the human rights? So that people could exercise this right, so they could exercise their right for faith, their right to confession. For example, today I confess in one church, but I can transit to another church, and the state cannot impose any conditions for me, so I should run around some lawyers and ask them to have my church transit to a different eparchy. So this right, it should be able to be exercised. There was another law that we were considering, again, with many authors, Soon, one of them is, and it regards not some specific church, but many churches, many religious organizations, and it sets better transparency because churches are non-profit organizations. So it sets more transparency in financial terms. It's not our committee, it's a tax committee. So we're ready to work with our colleagues. This law should be worked on in the first reading. So yeah, that's yet another law. But with all due respect, we denied the rest of the draft laws because we have to comply with the European standards of the regulation of this area. And first of all, we should guard the basic human rights. One of the basic human rights it's even more than a right. It's a freedom. It's a freedom of conscience. It's one of the fundamental things. Thank you, Mr. Mykyta. I'm reminding you, joining us was Mykyta Poturaiev, the chairman of the Parliamentary Committee on Humanitarian and Information Policy. Thank you for joining us. Dear journalists, our next briefing is at 16:30. Joining us online will be Vadim Pristaika, Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary Ambassador of Ukraine in Great Britain. And we will be talking about the United Kingdom's support for Ukraine. So bear with us, trust in our armed forces, and glory to Ukraine.